Hi, welcome back. Hopefully you understood and completed the first video. Now we're going to move on to the second main method that we use to gather crime statistics. So hopefully you're really good with the UCR and you're really familiar with it. Now we'll talk about the second main source of crime statistics. Okay, so hopefully you're following along with the PowerPoint. Now we're going to talk about the National Crime Victimization Survey. So remember we said there's two main sources of crime statistics, the Uniform Crime Reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey. So we're now going to look at that National Crime Victimization Survey. So remember we said it's maintained by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So remember the UCR was the FBI. The National Crime Victimization Survey is maintained by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Remember, the Uniform Crime Reports was based on police reports. The National Crime Victimization Survey is based on victim self-reports. So basically, they send out surveys to random people all over the country once a year, and they have just regular people fill out these surveys of when they were a victim of certain crimes. Now, one of the things we said about the Uniform Crime Reports is that it doesn't always count all crimes. So the National Crime Victimization Survey, the hope is by asking victims, you're going to get to a bigger level of actual crime, because we know not all crimes are actually reported to the police or arrests are not made. So if we ask victims, we ask victims, maybe they never reported it, but they'd be willing to report it in the survey. So it really shows you how many more crimes that we actually have. So when you hear people saying we need to get to the dark figures of crime, they're talking about the National Crime Victimization Survey because it counts more crimes. Now, the National Crime Victimization Survey is a little different based on the crimes that it actually counts. So some of them are the same as the Uniform Crime Reports, and some of them are different, okay? So when you look at it, you can see it still counts robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and rape. It does not count murder, kidnapping, arson, and those victimless Part 2 offenses. Now, why doesn't it count murder? Because remember, it's completed by victims. And if you're a victim of murder, you're no longer alive. So it can't really gather information on murders. And then it's just chosen not to count those other offenses. So one of the big distinctions is which crimes that it actually gathers information about. Now, you can probably see that there are potential problems with it. When you're just asking victims for their information, it could be false, they could report, they could lie, they could exaggerate, they may forget. If it's more minor offenses, they may not remember that certain things have happened to them. They may misinterpret events where it maybe wasn't really a crime, it was a misinterpretation of something. So there are some problems with the National Crime Victimization Survey too. So just like the Uniform Crime Reports, it's not really a perfect representation of the amount of crimes that occur in our country. Now, what do we learn from this National Crime Victimization Survey? Since we're getting information from victims, we can learn a lot of things. We know that at least 15% of households are touched by crime every year. There's 20 million victims per year. Only half of violent crimes are reported. So remember, not everything is reported. You would think mostly violent crimes would be reported, but we know that only half of them are. And even less property crimes are reported. Only a third of property crimes are reported. We know that 2/5 of all household crimes are reported. So less than half of household crimes, people think it's private, it's in their house, they don't want to report it. Only a fourth of personal theft, like when people steal from other people, are reported to the police. We also know a lot about victims. We know that men are much more likely than women to be victims of crime. But we know that if a woman is a victim, she's much more likely to be injured than a male would be. We know younger people are more likely to be victims than older. We know African Americans are much more likely to be victims of crime than any other racial group, and definitely of violent crimes. Because remember, we're looking at not crimes committed, we're looking at being a victim of these crimes. We know young males have the highest rate of criminal victimization of any group. We know that we have a much higher rate of victimization among lower income families. They're much more likely to become victims of crime. And if we had to identify which households are at the biggest risk of becoming victims of crime, we know that African Americans with 6 or more family members, headed by that you rent instead of own your house, and in big cities, you are much higher rate of being a victim to a crime in those circumstances. So this gives us some really detailed information about the victims of crime. So it's a different perspective on crime statistics, but it gives us some really valuable information. So when we look at these now, we have to determine, is it a UCR or is it NCVS? So I created an assessment that you can practice online to make sure you understand the distinctions between these two. You really want to make sure you know why and how they differ from each other. Okay. Now, another concept we want to talk about is what we call crime topography. We can take this information and these crime stats, and we can break crime into different categories. And then we can learn about those specific crimes in much more detail based on the crime statistics. So when you break crime down, you can look at certain categories: crimes against women, crimes against the elderly, hate crimes, corporate and white collar crime, organized crime, gun crime, drug crimes, technology, computer crimes, and terrorism. So we can really get a fuller picture and more detailed picture on some of these special categories of crime and how important they are, and how many new laws and policies and procedures should be developed to try to combat this, depending on what, how much of a problem that it is in our society. So you can see that we know that women are, as offenders, is starting to grow. And we know that women are less likely to be victims, but the more, if they are a victim, they're more likely to be hurt. Why do we care? Because we can create laws and policies to try to get around this. We can maybe come up with different policies to lessen the offenders, or different ways to protect women as victims. We know that there's a lot of crimes that are committed against the elderly. And is it increasing or is it decreasing? And we can keep track of that. Hate crimes. This has been a huge issue in recent years. There's been a significant rise in the number of hate crimes in this country. And we can track this, and they can report it, and we can keep tabs on how much of this is actually occurring. White collar crime is crime committed by people in a position of authority and abusing their position of authority. And so we can track those. Different times in the 90s, these were much higher, and we were really starting to go after people. Organized crime, do we still have the mafia and its organized crime? It's much more now gang related. We can trace a lot of it back to gangs. And then guns and crimes. We know that there's 10,000 murders in the US using guns. It's the #1 method used to commit murders. But there are other methods that are used. We need to know statistically more about the use of weapons to commit crimes, and when are they used, and are they legally owned, are they illegally owned? So as much data and statistics we can gather on this could help us form policies and procedures. Drug crimes, we can calculate the use of drugs. Right now, obviously fentanyl and a lot of different drugs right now are heroin overdoses. So we can track what drugs are being used, and how can we come up with policies and procedures to try to lessen that. Computer crime is its own distinct thing, and a lot of times it's tied to cyber terrorism and things like that. So it's a whole separate area of crime. And then terrorism, obviously, is always a concern in our country. And we can distinguish between domestic terrorism, cyber terrorism, international terrorism. So we can gather specific statistics in each of these potential areas. And then there's always the issue of international crime. What we know is that human trafficking and large criminal organizations are now crossing international borders. So we see a lot of trafficking from Europe to United States to Asia to all different parts of the world. So this is becoming more of an issue. And how do we police this, and how do we stop this on an international level? And that's also something that we have to think about. So all of this added up together is very expensive. We want to know about this, and we want to come up with policies and procedures to lessen this crime, because we know crime costs $17.6 billion every year. Economic loss, emotional loss, also the cost to prosecute people and punish them and keep them in corrections. So it costs a lot of money. And if we could find ways to reduce this, we could use that money in other things like schools or other programs to help people. Okay, so now we've learned about both of the crime set statistics, and now you can finish up your Chapter 2 assignment that's going to look at crime statistics. Don't forget, if you have any questions, you can always reach out. I'll be happy to answer them. The last lecture for the week, we're going to spend, it will probably be a little longer, because we're going to talk about the different theories of why people commit crime in the first place. And so we're going to look at a little concepts of criminology. So I hope you're enjoying these lecture videos. And if you have any questions, just reach out and ask me. I'll see you soon.